Nearly 500 years before Columbus crossed the Atlantic, a Viking ship was already sailing west. No modern maps, no GPS, no engines, just a wooden ship, a handful of sailors, and an ocean that seemed to stretch forever. The man leading them wasn't searching for America. He didn't even know America existed. He was searching for something beyond the edge of the known world. And when he finally reached land, he discovered forests, rivers, unfamiliar wildlife, and a world Europeans had never permanently settled before. His name was Leif Erikson, and his voyage would become one of the greatest exploration stories of the Viking Age. The son of Erik the Red, Leif was born around the year 970 AD. His father was a man we already know, Erik the Red. The Viking outlaw who had been forced to leave Iceland sailed west and established a Norse settlement in Greenland. Leif grew up in that harsh environment. Greenland was a difficult place to live, long winters, short growing seasons, limited farmland, and enormous distances between settlements. But Leif's family had something most people didn't. They knew how to cross the ocean. For generations, Viking sailors had pushed farther into the North Atlantic, Norway, Iceland, Greenland. Each generation had moved the edge of their world farther west, and beyond Greenland, there was still something unknown. The story of a land beyond Greenland, according to the Icelandic sagas. Leif eventually heard about an extraordinary voyage. An Icelandic trader named Bjarni Herjolfsson had been sailing toward Greenland when storms pushed his ship far off course. Instead of seeing Greenland, he saw unfamiliar coastlines, forests, mountains, a land that looked nothing like the frozen shores he expected, but Bjarni didn't explore it. He eventually reached Greenland and told others what he had seen. Leif was fascinated, because Greenland had a serious problem. Wood was scarce. Timber was needed for houses, ships, tools, firewood, almost everything. So the possibility of a western land covered in forests was impossible to ignore. The journey west. Around the year 1000 AD, Leif set sail. The exact details of his voyage come from later Icelandic sagas, so historians cannot be certain about every part of the journey. But the broad story is clear. Leif and his crew crossed the North Atlantic. They sailed into waters where storms could destroy a ship in minutes. They had no modern navigation. They depended on the sun, the stars, the wind, the waves, and generations of Viking knowledge. Then land appeared. The first place they encountered was cold and rocky. Massive stone landscapes, mountains, little vegetation. Leif named it Helluland. The name is generally understood as something like stone slab land. Many historians associate Helluland with Baffin Island in modern Canada. But Leif didn't stop there. He sailed farther south, and the world began to change. The land of forests. The next land was completely different. Instead of endless rock, there were forests. Trees stretched across the coastline. For Greenlanders, this was extraordinary. Timber was incredibly valuable. Leif's crew could finally obtain something their homeland desperately lacked: wood for construction, wood for tools, wood for ships. They explored the coast, collected timber, and continued south. But the greatest discovery was still ahead. Vinland. The landscape became greener. The climate was milder. Rivers flowed through the land. Wildlife was abundant. And according to the sagas, Leif's men discovered wild grapes. He called the region Vinland, usually translated as Wineland. Exactly what the name referred to remains debated. But the land itself was unlike anything the Greenland Vikings had known. There were forests, fresh water, meadows, and resources that could support a settlement. Leif and his crew spent the winter there. They built shelters, explored the surrounding area, gathered resources, and began what may have been the first known European settlement in North America. The people who were already there. But there was one thing Leif couldn't have ignored. They weren't entering an empty world. Indigenous peoples had lived throughout North America for thousands of years. The Vikings were newcomers. Later, Norse expeditions encountered indigenous populations. Some encounters were peaceful, others became violent. The Norse had ships and iron weapons, but they were vastly outnumbered in the wider landscape, and Greenland was thousands of miles away. That distance would eventually become one of their greatest weaknesses. The proof: for centuries. Leif's voyage existed mainly in the Icelandic sagas. Many people wondered whether the story was exaggerated. Then archaeology changed everything. In 1960, Norwegian explorers Helge Ingstad and Anne Stein Ingstad discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Meadows in Newfoundland. Archaeologists found evidence of Norse buildings, ironworking, and other artifacts associated with Viking settlement. The site dates to around the beginning of the 11th century. The discovery proved something extraordinary. The Vikings really had reached North America. The old stories weren't simply fantasy. There had actually been Norse explorers standing on the shores of the continent almost 5 centuries before Columbus. But Leif wasn't trying to discover America. There's something important we need to understand. Leif wasn't searching for a place called America. He had no concept of the modern world map. He was exploring, searching for resources, searching for land, searching for whatever existed beyond Greenland. Calling him the man who discovered America is a modern description. But his real achievement may be even more fascinating. He didn't know what was waiting beyond the horizon. He sailed anyway. The first Europeans in America. The Vikings had reached North America, but they hadn't discovered an empty continent. Indigenous societies already existed across the land. They had their own communities, their own territories, their own resources, and their own reasons to defend them. The Norse were thousands of miles from their homeland. Their settlement was small, and every additional ship from Greenland had to survive one of the most dangerous oceans on Earth. For a while, they managed. But the challenges were already becoming obvious. The struggle for Vinland. According to the sagas, Leif eventually returned to Greenland. Other Norse explorers continued the voyages west. His brother Thorvald is said to have explored further. Later expeditions attempted to establish stronger connections with Vinland. But contact with indigenous populations became increasingly difficult. The Norse wanted resources. The local populations had their own interests. Small conflicts could escalate quickly. And unlike Greenland, there was no large Norse population waiting nearby to provide reinforcements. The Vikings had discovered North America, but they couldn't simply claim it. Why didn't the Vikings stay? This is one of the biggest questions surrounding Leif Erikson's story. If the Vikings had found forests, fresh water, wildlife, and fertile land, why didn't they build a massive colony? There probably wasn't one simple answer. Distance was enormous. Greenland itself was difficult to supply. The North Atlantic was dangerous. The Norse population was small, and they were dealing with established indigenous communities. A temporary settlement was possible. A permanent colony on a large scale was much harder. Eventually, the Norse presence in North America faded. The lost settlement. The Vikings left behind little physical evidence. For centuries, their North American journey disappeared from mainstream European history. The sagas survived in Iceland, but outside the Norse world, few people knew about the voyages. The settlement at Meadows eventually disappeared beneath the landscape. Wooden buildings decayed, people left, and the story became almost mythical Imagine that a group of Europeans had crossed the Atlantic, reached North America, built a settlement, and then disappeared. For centuries, the world forgot. The man before Columbus. Centuries later, Christopher Columbus would become famous for his 1492 voyage. His journey changed European history forever. But Leif Erikson had crossed the Atlantic almost 500 years earlier. That's why Leif is often remembered as one of the first known Europeans to reach North America. But there's an important distinction. We can say with strong archaeological evidence that Norse explorers were in North America around the 11th century. The sagas identify Leif as the explorer who reached Vinland. But archaeology cannot prove that Leif personally stood at every site described in the sagas. That distinction matters, because history isn't about making the best story sound certain. It's about understanding what we know and what we don't. The Viking Atlantic. Leif's journey was part of something much bigger. The Vikings had created an extraordinary chain across the North Atlantic. Norway, Iceland, Greenland, North America. Each settlement depended on ships. Each voyage required knowledge passed from one generation to another. They didn't have modern navigation. They didn't have engines. They didn't have satellites. They had wooden ships, sailors, and an understanding of the ocean built through centuries of experience. The Atlantic wasn't a barrier to them. It was a road. The legacy of Leif Erikson. Leif didn't build an empire. He didn't conquer a kingdom. He didn't become one of the richest rulers of the Viking Age. His achievement was different. He expanded the boundaries of the known world. He proved that the Atlantic could be crossed. He helped establish a Norse presence in lands thousands of miles from Scandinavia, and his story survived long after the settlement disappeared. The Vikings are often remembered as raiders, but Leif shows another side of their world. They were explorers, navigators, settlers, farmers, and adventurers. They didn't always sail across the ocean looking for someone to fight. Sometimes they simply wanted to know what was beyond the horizon. The Viking who reached America. Nearly 5 centuries before Columbus, a Viking ship crossed the Atlantic. Its crew reached unfamiliar shores. They found forests, built shelters, explored the land, and eventually they returned home. The settlement disappeared. The voyages became stories, and the world forgot, until archaeology brought the Vikings back into the story. Leif Erikson wasn't looking for America. He didn't know America existed. He was simply looking beyond the edge of his world. And on the other side of the ocean, he found an entirely new one. He sailed west into the unknown and reached a continent centuries before Columbus.